I see people are starting to dial in and log into the webinar. We are going to get started in about 2 or 3 minutes. Hi folks, we're going to give other people 1 more minute to log in and dial in, but we're going to get started in just 1 minute, so thanks for your patience. Hi everyone, and welcome to the April meeting of the Restoring Neighborhoods Task Force. Thanks for taking some time with us this afternoon. We have a great presentation for you today from Jason Hessler and Michael Braverman with the City of Baltimore. Before we jump into that, Caitlin and I are going to give you a couple of brief policy updates. And just to start with introductions, my name is Rebecca King. I'm a policy associate with the National Housing Conference, and we have Caitlin Snyder, and I'm a policy and research associate with the National Housing Conference. So with that, we are going to dive into the policy updates, and Caitlin's going to start with appropriations. Yeah, so the Senate is back this week after recess, and the House is still in recess until April 12th. A couple weeks ago, the House Appropriations Committee approved the FY17 appropriations for the Military Construction and Veterans Affairs, really kicking off the appropriations process. And this week, we're looking for what the Senate will be doing in their Appropriations Committee on the 12 fiscal 2017 spending bills. They haven't announced which one they will consider first, but Chairman Lamar Alexander says that the Environment and Water Development Subcommittee would be the first one. And Senator Barbara Mikulski, who's the ranking member on the committee, said that the Senate Appropriations Committee will start voting on bills by April 12th. Speaker Paul Ryan has pledged not to hold any floor votes on appropriations bills until the budget is resolved. The House Republicans have drafted a budget resolution, but the Freedom Caucus opposes the resolution, so it will most likely fail a floor vote. And so without a budget, appropriators will have to use the $1.7 trillion spending cap from the bipartisan budget agreement that passed last year. And Appropriations Committee Chairman Hal Rogers plans to move appropriations bills forward, assuming that the spending caps will remain in place.
And so voting is on all 12 spending bills theoretically should be happening between May 15th and September 30th, but that'll be challenging this year with Congress out of session, so much in July to attend the presidential conventions.
So basically, appropriations could move, but I think we are planning on a continuing resolution in some form or another. But we'll see what happens over the coming weeks. Next up is principal reduction. If you didn't see it, Mel Watt, in a speech to the Women in Housing and Finance Luncheon a few weeks ago, said that FHFA has come to a decision about principal reduction. He did not say what it was. An article in the Wall Street Journal suggests that it will be a limited policy for about 50,000 or so homeowners who owe more than their homes are worth and are behind on their mortgage payments. Again, Director Watt did not say that in his remarks, so we'll see exactly what the decision is, but it should be coming any time now. This is part of a long conversation that is finally coming to an end. We've seen principal reduction outside of the GSEs, but the GSEs have not taken it up yet. They have done principal forbearance and short sales, but they've really been struggling with how to implement a policy that didn't encourage strategic default and kind of had the best outcomes for the various parties. So we will see what that policy looks like. In terms of fair housing, just this week HUD has come out with new guidance from the Office of General Counsel around ex-offenders. And so basically a blanket policy rejecting ex-offenders can be considered discriminatory, and so this guidance kind of walks through an analysis of how a provider might determine that, or how HUD will determine that, I should say. So this is also going to be the beginning of a long conversation. This guidance, this policy builds on the disparate impact standard that was upheld last summer by the Supreme Court. And it's starting to get more specific in terms of HUD policies related to disparate impact, but it's still not specific enough in terms of giving property owners exact steps on what they can and cannot do. It also may conflict with existing HUD rules on screening of tenants. So that will also have to get resolved. Nixon Peabody has blogged about it, and we will share that in the notes. But it will be interesting to see how this evolves and moves forward. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on is HUD has announced the funding level for the National Housing Trust Fund for the upcoming year. It'll be about $174 million, which is good because it's over the minimum amount needed so that HUD can follow the formula it created. It doesn't have to go open for public comment because there was less than the minimum funding needed. So hopefully allocations to states will be announced soon. The National Low-Income Housing Coalition has kind of put out estimates, but they aren't the official numbers, but that could be helpful for folks in thinking about it. And then Caitlin has one last update.
Yeah, so yesterday, JPMorgan Chase announced a 5-year, $125 million initiative to create economic opportunity in struggling neighborhoods by boosting community development organizations and fostering collaboration among regional CDFIs. So the initiative is called Partnership for Raising Opportunity in Neighborhoods, or PRO Neighborhoods. And the RFP is currently open until May 16th. And successful applicants are eligible for a 3-year grant of up to $5 million. And they're really looking for CDFIs and their partners to apply for these. And we will also include links to the release and some information about that as well in the notes. With that closes out our policy updates. We're going to turn it over to Jason and Michael. You can see it on the agenda, but Jason Hessler is the Assistant Commissioner for Litigation with the City of Baltimore, and Michael Braverman is the Deputy Commissioner for Code Enforcement. And they're going to talk about their Vacants to Value program, as well as some recent state and I think local money for strategic demolition. So with that, I'm going to give the screen over to Jason and let them start their presentation. Except for folks listening,
as you think of questions, please go ahead and send them through the question box. Don't wait till the end. We will get to them at the end, but as they occur to you, please just go ahead and send them in. And with that, we will start Jason Michael's presentation.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of myself and Jason, we're going to just jump right into it, and we look forward to the questions that you have. Just for a brief overview, I'm going to talk a little bit about Baltimore and our vacant building issues. Jason's going to talk very specifically about the deployment of some strategies in particular neighborhoods. What you're looking at on your screen is on the left, it's a housing market typology that's done for us by TRF. Many of you are probably familiar with TRF and their and the work that they do for cities around the country. And on the right is the map shows where the vacant buildings are concentrated in the city of Baltimore. So for the most part, the distressed markets in the market typology correspond almost one-for-one for the concentration of vacants. At the 10,000 foot level, Baltimore is probably a thriving city in many ways with some very distressed markets. We were built out for close to 1 million people around 1950. We were an industrial city with a major industrial employment base, Beth Steel being one of the most significant employers. Beth Steel, that sort of employment configuration has long since passed us. There have been massive changes in the macroeconomic economy, and Bethlehem Steel doesn't employ a single person today. And so in a lot of ways, we're a legacy city that has markets for housing, with housing for which there is almost no demand. And in the areas that are sort of the sort of salmon color, we have an extraordinary concentration of vacants. So under Mayor Rawlings Blake, we set out to put together a program to deal with blight, with the understanding that, it isn't as traditionally, or as the popular narrative has often put it, a problem that is due to sort of bad landlords or individual actors who need to be held accountable through code enforcement. It's enormous macroeconomic changes. We have 350,000 less people, and we have essentially a capital dollar problem in many of our markets. And speaking with this group, you understand all that, and there's no real sensible national urban policy to provide the capital dollars that are in excess of $500 million to address this sort of infrastructure issues. That's the big picture. We will talk at the end, after Jason speaks more directly to some particular neighborhoods, about the demolition dollars and programs that we do have, because we have some new money from our governor. That said, through Vacants to Value, we have some very strategic approaches to vacant buildings and blight in different market areas. So in the areas of most concentrated blight, but that are very sort of very small areas that are proximate to some strength, like by Johns Hopkins Hospital, by another major employer or park, there is developer interest in very specific areas, basically because we're interested in living in cities right now. So we have a kind of a return to the city to some extent. They're looking for authenticity, for neighborhoods, some of our traditional neighborhoods. They're willing to buy homes and live in areas where we may have sort of weak schools, but that's not necessarily a consideration for these new home buyers. And in these areas, there are capitalized developers that we partner with. We literally, sit down around the table with folks who have access to capital, which is not traditional bank capital 99 out of 100 times. And, they understand the demand, they understand their buyers or their renters, and working with them, we could define footprints, and Jason will talk more in detail about that. And we literally can use a host of code enforcement tools under Vacants to Value that Jason will talk about in detail. We can also use a tool that we call receivership. It's a code enforcement tool that lets us sort of directly auction the properties. And in these markets, a couple of these neighborhoods, which citywide, you can see that in these areas, we've shown a 35% reduction in vacant buildings. So we have some extraordinary successes with this approach, while vacant buildings in the city in general have either gone up or generally been stagnant. Jason, we just switched to the next slide. Here's the trend downwards in 3 areas where this community development cluster strategies has been deployed. So even in distressed markets where there's demand, we can increase the sort of amplitude and the timing within which activity occurs. And again, Jason will talk about that in detail. So vacants to value is about these strategic code enforcement approaches, but fundamentally identifying and understanding the markets and tailoring our approaches to those particular markets. In middle market neighborhoods, we have a code enforcement approach that begins with citations, so we can move relatively quickly to getting our point across to property owners. Without having to go to the courts, we rely heavily on executive authority. In our really distressed markets where there is no demand, no capitalized partners, no real demand for housing in the foreseeable future, we use code enforcement to inspect affirmatively the buildings to ensure that they're clean and secure, and we do strategic demolitions to protect, the enclaves of homeowners that do exist even in our weakest markets. We also have built the ability to convey city-owned properties timely, predictably, and with that combination of capital dollar tools, stabilization, demolition, the ability to dispose city-owned properties timely, the code enforcement tools to take care of privately owned properties. We don't need to own them to get an outcome. We have built sort of an environment, a predictable enough environment where private capital can make business decisions that they feel comfortable. So we've built partnerships not just with our nonprofit partners, which we have, but with an extraordinary array of for-profit partners. We also have a component that works with existing homeowners in the neighborhoods we're working, turn around to make sure that energy efficiency and slip and fall and other investments can be made so that we can keep existing homeowners in their homes as long as they want to, and reduce their costs and increase their safety. And we have a planning department component where we get out there and meet with communities and do clean and green on the back end for any of the demolitions that we're doing to promote the greenest possible outcome, fencing, grass, hardscaping, whatever the community is looking for in that particular place and for an interim use. So that's just laying out, and of course the mayor's program would continue the large-scale major redevelopment that everybody is familiar with, that creates some extraordinary anchors around which these programs of lower capital intensity are deployed. So EBDI, East Baltimore Development, Inc., 90 acres of acquisition, consolidation and redevelopment, and around the success of that has led to incredible sort of interest in living and developer interest in renovating, and so major redevelopment continuing that is a part and component of vacants to value. So in sum, before I pass it over to Jason, vacants to value is really an overall architecture within which we can take all of our blight elimination initiatives and coordinate them around an understanding of the markets and a tailored strategy for each of them. And with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Jason about kind of how it works.
Right. And so within that overarching vacants to value architecture, enforcement, really kind of 2 pieces within our city. The first part was our traditional code enforcement that we were always doing, where there was already a market and there were just some houses that needed enforcement to push them along and get them back into the appropriate status, get the violation notice abated or get the owner to move with selling the property or get it away from them and sell it, and that's where receivership came in. So we were doing that in established markets and really didn't have the right set up an architecture in order to do it in the more distressed neighborhoods, something like Greenmount West, where at the time there wasn't a market that was really moving. We didn't identify a market, and what ended up happening with Vacants to Value is the market kind of came to us, and we helped build the market by making contacts with developers and neighborhood associations, groups like Habitat, and we sat down with a map just like this one, and all the brown marks on there, those are individual lots that had vacant building notices on them. So back in 2010, we had 179 vacant buildings in Greenmount West, and we drew a line on the map and said, this is our footprint where we can actually do some enforcement, and these different market players will step up, and if the owner of the property isn't willing to rehab the property, they're going to step up and they'll buy it at receivership auction. And we started individually, property by property, having our attorneys actually review each property and make a determination as to what the appropriate strategy for each individual property was. In some cases, the property was too far gone and demolition was necessary. In some cases, we could identify an owner that we either had a history with, they may have owned other properties in the city and successfully rehabbed them, or they were able to come to us and show us that they had the ability to rehab the properties. So we would work with some of the owners. The goal here for all of our receiverships is always the ultimate outcome of abating the vacant building notice. We're not looking to move properties into the hands of a particular developer or to a particular use, but just abate the vacant building notice and bring the property up to, a legal use within the neighborhood.
Jason, could I jump in and say that, as part of Vacants to Value, the code enforcement piece is critical because the bulk of the vacants are privately owned, but a significant number of vacants in this neighborhood were publicly owned as a result of previous acquisition strategies. There's very few neighborhoods in the whole city that fit this category, distressed neighborhoods in their entirety that we can turn around. But this was one of them. So it's a combination of being able to address both the public and the privately owned vacants. And in this case, you see a lot of notations indicating dispositions so that buyers know that there are whole block solutions for every block, and in this case, a neighborhood. Sorry, Jason.
No, that's exactly right. It was key for us, whenever we do enforcement, it's impossible to take a private property owner to court on their vacant building when there's a city-owned vacant building right next door. And so that's definitely a key strategy in all this, is working hand in hand with our land resources division and actively marketing those properties and having, buyers out there that are willing, ready, and able to rehab those city-owned vacants, in addition to the privately owned where the owners don't have the financial ability or know-how to get the job done. And so going through property by property and identifying the best strategies, and then we just began following those receivership cases. And for anybody that doesn't know, the very, very basics for receivership. It's an action we file in our district court. It is authorized through our building code, and we petition the court to appoint a third-party receiver to basically step into the shoes of the property owner. And in Baltimore, we use our receiver almost entirely to qualify the bidders at auction and to auction off the properties. Our statute allows for the receiver to demo or to rehab and recover money or sell the property, but we find that the best method is to have the receiver focus in on moving the property from delinquent property owner to a qualified buyer that can rehab it, and let the market handle the property the rest of the way. But the attorney's job isn't done at the auction. They have to continue to monitor these properties, make sure that whoever did buy them lives up to what was expected, and that the properties actually get rehabbed. And it's kind of a constant battle. So you can see here, 5 years after launch of Vacants to Value in the Greenmount West area, we had a net change of 117 vacants down. So there are roughly 2 vacant buildings within Greenmount West currently, and it's still an ongoing project in there. Just to show another area, Harwood was a little different. With Harwood, there was a pretty entrenched drug activity, and so moving those properties first required the assistance of the police to help move, some of that drug activity out. And so instead of doing the whole community, we focused in on just that blue outlined area. And we did the same approach as far as evaluating all the properties, bringing the necessary tools to bear, and you can see, demolition, that on the right side of the screen there, we ended up demolishing 12 properties or 11 properties in there, because everyone that looked at those properties told us, we can't do any other development in the area unless these things are gone, because everybody driving into the neighborhood sees this first and then they just keep going. So they don't even turn down the street to see our new rehab or what possibilities exist. And so the demo there had to occur in order to support the receivership efforts and the rehab efforts that were going to take place within the larger area. And as the rehab and receivership activity started happening in that area, then the area was expanded, and actually outside of the blue, we were initially using citations to motivate people to begin work, but then following that up with receivership actions. And you can see there's been a net change of 45. We're down 45 vacant buildings in that area, a total of 50 vacant buildings. Sorry. So, where was it? Michael, did you have anything to add?
No, I only wanted to say that, when dealing with blight, there are strategies to rehab that we have that Jason's talked about, but I think one of the things to take away from it is there's sometimes certain things that are, for lack of a better term, radioactive, and they are driving investment and people away. And often, especially in a city like Baltimore, it's some kind of drug activity, and spending the time to identify sort of the place-based problem very specifically and addressing it is, a critical part of getting investment and demand back into an area. And so that 400 block of Whitridge was radioactive. And we were very fortunate to have partners in the police department that we worked with, and Jason and his team had some extraordinary code enforcement tools that we used, drug nuisance actions that let us work with the information provided by the police department and literally file actions to get people put out of their homes if they were renters, and literally to sell homes from underneath people who were owners but who were incapable of stopping the ongoing drug activity at their homes, no matter how many raids the police made. So we took place-based approaches based on the police information, and that was the first step to turning it around. So I just wanted to note that it's not just getting money into houses, it's not just demolishing those that can't be rehabbed, but it's also eliminating some of the nuisance activities that are that are negatively impacting the market in an extraordinary way.
The other, I think, big struggle that we have with our vacant buildings is just we have an aging population. Many of our vacants are due to the prior owner is deceased. Either there is no family, or the family isn't interested or able to care for the property. And even in cases where estates are open, the properties are never managed, and they just lay in waste. So with receivership, we actually worked with our city law department and struck an agreement where a city employee will act as personal representative, and one of our attorneys in code enforcement will open an estate, appoint that personal representative so that we can proceed with the receivership process. These are properties that so much money is owed in back taxes and water bills and other costs that they don't sell at tax sale, and the property owner can't move them because they're gone. And so this the receivership process with the ability to open the estate has enabled us to move a lot of properties that were otherwise stuck. And without that tool, we would still be struggling today in a lot of these blocks.
Should we jump over to demolition, Jason? Is that the next slide? This slide is just something we prepared for the police department, but it's just a good trigger for me to Jason. Actually, if we go back to the concentration of vacant slide, right there. Yeah, thank you. So no matter kind of in the best case scenario, absorbing as much of the vacant building inventory as we could expect to have happen, we are not going to absorb all of our vacant property. And so demolition is going to have to be a part of our strategy. And it is, and there's obviously emergencies and constituent-driven demolitions that account for at least $3 million a year alone. But there's strategic demolition that in Baltimore, because of our row house environment, would require the acquisition and relocation of property and relocation of individuals, because we could have a row house block that could be 85% vacant. That's maybe 20, 30 houses with only a couple of people living there. But in order to get the whole block down, we'd have to do those 1 or 2 relocations. And so that becomes very pricey, and that puts us up into the cost environment of a, not quite Detroit, but closer than you would expect. And so we estimate our total need at north of $500 million. So when we get an allocation from our mayor, which she stepped up as part of Vacants to Value and out of our general revenue and our bonds, she's given us an additional $7 million a year, so that we're at $10 million for demo a year. And so we're able to look at, our weakest markets where we will even have home ownership, and we can strategically target demolition to stabilize adjacent blocks. Also, in some of these community development cluster areas, you saw it very slightly in Greenmount West, but there are other areas. Oliver would be a good example, Jason, if you just want to go to that slide. I don't know if the for Oliver, this is Forest Park. Well, we don't have this marked on the slide, but this is an area where we're seeing extraordinary investment. All those greens indicate formerly vacant buildings that have been renovated. But for some of these areas, we're not showing our demolition, but in some of these areas, in order to get the renovations on the principal blocks, because this was a very distressed area, we need to do demolition on the adjacent alley blocks. So strategically, we're using demolition to leverage investment, to stabilize communities, to create interim and permanent green space. We're spending, along with our emergencies, about $10 million a year. And just recently, literally, our governor stepped up and announced that he wants to provide an additional brand new money, $75 million over the next, including some $7 million and change in this fiscal year, over the next 3 fiscal years, a total of $75 million of new demolition funding. And so there are plenty of places where the strategy I just outlined could be deployed. There's an extraordinary need for demolition, so it's very welcome, and I think it puts us in the right footing for the argument that I think we all need to make, essentially, that that these are, even at best, these are not locally, we cannot capitalize this need locally. This is a national urban policy issue to adjust our infrastructure for the city that we have today. There is no redevelopment potential in many of the areas that require demolition, and not on the blocks we're demolishing, even to leverage adjacent investment. So with that said, Jason, is there anything to add before we open it up?
No, I'm good.
Rebecca, would it be appropriate to open it up to questions now?
Yes, that would be great. And I have some, but I did get a very specific question that I wanted to ask from one of the audience members about the mix of public and privately owned vacants in Baltimore. Like, what's the ratio or absolute numbers, whichever, if you know that off the top of your head?
Yeah, sure. Look, in general, it's helpful to say what we mean by a vacant building, and I probably should have said that at the outset. Different cities, are using different metrics. The census has their, vacant buildings, and that's usually an unoccupied unit, whether that unit's in a luxury condo or not. The post office uses undeliverable addresses. Those numbers are in the 30 to 40,000 range in Baltimore. We use an inspection that has been documented by our housing inspectors to determine that the building is both unoccupied and either unfit or unsafe for human habitation. And that means that if the building, had 100 units in it, once we determine it to be vacant and unsafe, it's one vacant building. And so we have we're closing in right now at close to 17,000 of those both unoccupied and either unsafe or unfit structures. And of those, maybe 2,500 are publicly owned.
Got it. Thank you. So I did have a couple of questions, things I wanted to kind of go back to, and they're in no particular order, but in terms, you talked about demolition throughout the presentation. So what I'm curious about is when properties are demolished, then what happens? And I know you mentioned the clean and greening with the communities, but does it really depend on the neighborhood that the unit's in, or do some get vacant, demolished parcels then become new construction? Kind of what does that look like?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, because again, there's this idea, and it sort of makes sense in a thriving market, that but for this blight, there would be redevelopment. The reason, it's really the other way around. The reason we have the blight is because there is, generally speaking, no development potential, right? So yeah, there can be low-income housing tax credit deals, and that happens in places. But in terms of reviving the private housing, the demand for the lot for redevelopment, most of those markets in Baltimore don't have blight that need demolition. The blight that we have that needs demolition are in markets where there's no other way to capitalize it because there's no demand for the land, and so other than publicly capitalize it. And so interim green space, with the hopes that maybe someday that math might change, or permanent green space for stormwater management or urban forestry, are some of those uses. Creating space for commercial urban farming has also been another approach here in Baltimore City. And then in some areas where we're demolishing because there is investment opportunities on the principal streets, there's demand on the principal streets, and we're demolishing alley streets, in the future it's likely that might become land attached to the new housing, maybe for parking, or because parking is an issue. So, but the idea that there's true development potential is is really not the case in a lot of the markets. Again, we're now an eds and meds economy that's not going to absorb the physical space of our former industrial economy.
Right, that makes sense.
So, yeah, so I just want to add so that in these cases, very simply, down is better than up, you know, and
Yeah.
and so we do take some flack from folks that, well, what is the plan for the space? We're like, right now, you know, the block, and if you see photos of them, it's very depressing. An endless block of dilapidated housing that's a danger and a attractive nuisance for all sorts of mischief that makes it nearly impossible to live nearby.
And also, just to support that, I mean, we're already, for most of these properties, the city's going out and cleaning the backyards and cutting the weeds and grass. So with them being down, it makes it a lot easier to maintain. And then we've built, within code enforcement, a very robust illegal dumping team of investigators that go out and will go through and find the dumpers, and we've got some great strategies around that to help keep the neighborhood cleaner than when the vacant buildings are up.
Oh, that's a good point. I'm glad to learn that. And I think we'll make sure to put that in the notes for folks, because what the Baltimore example really points out for me is this kind of holistic, comprehensive approach to blight and needing multiple strategies. But we have gotten a couple of questions in, and one is if you could go a little bit more into detail about properties with deceased owners and how you crack open the estate.
Sure.
That's all you.
Yep, that's me. So if an estate was previously opened, we go back to the orphans court and petition for it to be reopened for the purpose of filing a receivership. So in our motion that we file, it specifies the purpose. But in most cases, we find that there's just been nothing. The person died and that was the end of it. And so in those cases, we're actually going in and opening an estate. It's very similar to what hospitals do when someone dies in a hospital, and they have bills that are due, and the hospital wants to close out the account. So we'll petition the orphans court, the same as I did when my father passed. Just file the paperwork, do the appropriate advertising, and then another attorney in our office will actually file the receivership case and serve the estate. The case will go forward. Actually, those cases, because it's usually just the estate, they move pretty fast. But there's potential that there could have also been a mortgage that never got foreclosed or other judgments. So we notify everybody that has an interest in the property. Once the receivership case is closed out, and the property's been auctioned and settled, if there's any money left over, which is extremely rare for these properties, but if there was any money left over, then we would either have to disperse it if there were known heirs, or turn it over to the state as unclaimed funds. But generally, it's just for the purpose of being able to serve somebody. So hopefully that.
Can I just add one thing, Jason, and that is that in order to do this sort of code enforcement activity, including the estate work Jason's describing, it's important. It's sort of part of the sort of fundamentals at the front end, like the spring training fundamentals, is that we have to be able to find everybody associated with a property, not just the owners, but anyone who has an interest in the property even, in order to file receiverships and to convey good title on the back end. Everyone has to be properly noticed. In order to get compliance, where we're going to get compliance on the front end of the process, it's incumbent upon us to identify the appropriate responsible parties, notice them early on, and open a dialogue. And to do the estate work, Jason's teams need to be able to identify the heirs. So we have a crackerjack investigative unit that reports to Jason, and as Jason mentioned earlier, they do a phenomenal amount of work around illegal dumping investigations, but they can find anybody. And so when we have a vacant property in Baltimore City, we have no issue about finding responsible parties because we have professionals on the job, and that separates the work from our housing inspectors and building inspectors who could concentrate on their core functions. I just wanted to add that's an important part of the mix. Sorry, Becca, that concludes that.
No, that's great. I think that's all really helpful information because I'm imagining that is one of the most challenging aspects is when ownership is non-existent in a sense. So I appreciate the elaboration. We have a somewhat specific question about demolition in that does the city ever do deconstruction as part of the demolition to try and get some value out of the property on the way down?
Yeah, that is another great question. So, so deconstruction, is something that has often been talked about. At the end of the day, Baltimore procures its demolition services, very similarly to any other service that we procure. We put out a request for bids, and somebody has to be, in this case, licensed, insured, bonded, and be able to, it's a demolition license, insured and bonded, and be able to do that demolition at a competitive price. And so deconstruction, has extraordinary value in that it can be a job creator, not just about, the excavator and the individual with the hose and somebody running on the debris pile to salvage, but, a much more, a greater labor force in depth. But also because on the back end, you would be creating an industry in the waste stream products, and in Baltimore, that's principally the masonry and board feet of structural lumber. And so we wanted to do that for some time, but it's a business proposition, and to get those benefits at the expense of our demolition budget, which as we mentioned earlier, is extraordinary need, limited budget, and and those benefits we didn't want to take at the expense of our demolitions. But recently, we couldn't be more fortunate in that we have a nonprofit partner in Baltimore called Humanum, and they have a subsidiary called Details, and they felt that as a business proposition they could make it work. Some of which comes from underwriting, from foundation support, and some of which comes from building that back-end industry in the waste stream products. And we put together a request for bids for a pilot project in which we were willing to take pay a little bit more for our demolitions in return for these benefits, and to create 25 full-time equivalencies and a very specific amount of reclamation of bricks and board feet of lumber, which is extraordinary, actually, amounts. And they put together a great program, bid competitively. They were about 20% more than our lowest bidder, and the pilot. We went with the pilot. They did about a little more than 100 buildings under the pilot. We put out a new, and again, there was like a startup. They became much more efficient and learned a lot. And in the second request for bids for deconstruction, they came to about, I would say, they halved it. They're about 10% higher than our the lowest bidder. So right now we have I'd say a competitive bid deconstruction program that is growing in Baltimore and providing jobs and really building an industry. There are all sorts of buyers for these waste stream products now, and it's only growing, and demand is growing. And as you know, you probably can't go into a newly constructed venue these days and not see distressed lumber. Some of that's going to come from Baltimore. So
that's great.
Yeah, so we're very fortunate to have a nonprofit partner, and I would have to say that, in speaking for myself and Jason, we're very, very lucky to have the nonprofit partners that we have in Baltimore. So Humanum and their subsidiary Details, we could not have a successful deconstruction program without them. And I would say that our entire receivership program is predicated on the strength of our nonprofit third-party receiver called One House at a Time. You know, they're it's a volunteer board, very competent volunteer board of committed people, many attorneys, and then they have a paid executive director and staff, and they manage the receiverships. Jason didn't mention it, but his team has filed, Jason, more than 2,000 in the past several years.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So that, you know, we're at scale here with these things. So our nonprofit receiver, we're very fortunate to have them. So I just wanted to mention that our nonprofit partners are, you know, a big part of what lets us accomplish some of these goals.
No, I'm glad you mentioned that. That had been one of my questions, was how you recruited or built those relationships with both nonprofits and for-profits.
Yeah, there's a separate issue of our nonprofit and for-profit developers. You know, and I would say, you know, the for-profit developers, it took proof of concept, you know, for them. I mean, they don't risk capital, which is their own. I mean, the years of 2006 are long gone. This is real money now, and you know, they're either borrowing it at 13% from hard money lenders, or it's equity. You know, their own, you know, investor dollars, and so it took a while to build their confidence, and now they will make investment decisions on the basis of our ability to deliver whole block solutions. So the private sector relationships took a lot of time to cultivate. We're blessed with some great nonprofit partners here in Baltimore.
Yeah, and what's on the screen right now is the Oliver cluster, which is, you know, about 7 blocks by 4 blocks roughly. And when we started in 2010, it was really just 3 or 4 blocks in 2 different groupings, where a couple of investor developers came in and said, I know everything else looks rough, but I can make this block work right here. And we started with them there. Somebody else came around, you know, for another block. And then as they started to show some success, it started attracting, you know, other people. And ultimately, we had to change the boundaries of all these little individual groups working on 1 or 2 blocks or 3 or 4 blocks to encompass the whole area.
And I would add one thing. The area on the right on the map, it has a little bit drawn like a gold a border. That's the only thing that isn't squared off. Yeah, it's right there. That's actually the Amtrak line, and that's the northern boundary of what's called EBDI, which I mentioned, a 90-acre major redevelopment. And you could see that our cluster, our community development cluster, is on the border of this major redevelopment. So it's the private sector and our nonprofit partners, you know, understanding that, forgive me for lack of a better term, that beachfront has been created right here in the midst of one of the most distressed, it's like ground zero of one of the most distressed places in Baltimore City, and now it's a prime spot to sell a house for $300,000, which, by the way, is a lot of money in Baltimore for like a 2,500 square foot 3-story row house. It's actually a lot of money, and so to have that market transaction with a buyer of choice, you know, on the back end of investing your capital, is a pretty big leap of faith and an indicator of how strong the market is. But one of the anchors starting this was, again, one of our nonprofit partners. I mentioned TRF before. You know, they kind of walk on water in a lot of ways, in my opinion. But in this case, they have a development part. They're not just their group that does the market value analysis, but they actually do development, and there's TRF development partners, and they've invested an extraordinary amount of capital with this idea of, you know, building a market and passing the baton to private market actors who got in here very early with TRF. But I just wanted to say that it's their work, and their work doing equitable development with, you know, community organizing, a group in Baltimore called BUILD, Baltimoreans United in Leadership Development, which is a church-based organizing group, and TRF does all their work sort of from the ground up organizing the community and working with the community and the churches to understand each and every investment decision. So it's there's a lot of moving parts there, and we're very happy about the way they're coming together.
No, that's great to hear. Equitable development is definitely something that when it's done well, it has major positive impacts to the whole community. We are going to wrap up here, but I do have two last questions from the audience I want to get to. And one is a sense of scale. So how many properties do you demolish currently with your budget, and then what are you hoping to do with the new state money? Like what's the growth potential there?
Right. Well, look, the reality is that you know, we've figured that that the governor's $25 million a year, with all the other costs associated with, you know, acquisition and relocation, our environmentals, our back end greening, you know, will give us about 1,000 properties. And so where we are now with our, you know, the money that we get, it takes a little bit. When the money comes in the beginning of the conveyor belt, all the kinds of, so there's we don't go to court for this stuff unless the eminent domain is required. But as a general rule, the privately owned vacant buildings, Jason and his team will allow for the process that is due, notice and opportunity for a hearing, and failure to abate the vacant building notice, which is, you know, 9 times out of 10 not going to happen in these markets, gives us the authority to do demolition. When we have to do those few acquisitions and relocations, it takes a little bit of time for that to happen, for the folks to be conversations to be had and best solutions found, and that's a little more than a year. So it takes a while to do that. It's not like you get the money and you could do the demolitions that year. I wanted to get a sense. It's kind of like about 2 years out from the budget. It's all done. It's, you know, some amount falling out at different times. So we were doing about 250 demos a year with the limited budgets that we had. We did about 250 in the last calendar year. In the calendar year that we're in now, we expect to do probably 600. You know, and then, you know, we expect that to grow to about 1,200 a year. Again, that's not going to, you know, significantly mitigate, that's not going to eliminate our large pool of vacants for which there's not a demand. But if we do that strategically, if every one of those, you know, is designed to get an outcome, I think we can really continue to move our markets and stabilize our communities. But it's not going to be the dollar amount that's going to eliminate this vacant building problem you're seeing on the right side of the map on your screen.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And demolition, it just doesn't make sense to as a large-scale solution, but it does make sense as one of the tools in the toolbox.
Right.
So, and we'll just close with a clarifying question about the receivership program. You mentioned a nonprofit. Can you just clarify, because I think what you said is that the nonprofit is the only receiver, the only third-party receiver, or is it kind of an open, not an open process? Is it?
Well, so it's an open process in that others could be receivers.
Okay.
But One House at a Time currently serves as the receiver within Baltimore City. And I guess the point is, when we file our petition in court, the owner still has an opportunity to step up and show the court that they have the ability to rehab the property. They know what it's going to take. You know, they come in with construction timeline and finances, and they could be, you know, we could get the receiver appointed with a stay to allow the owner to get the use and occupancy. In some cases, the banks step up because they're interested in the property, but they had failed to file a foreclosure action. And in some cases, they're appointed as the receiver to rehab the property. and then at the same time they will begin their foreclosure process, so that at the end they have a rehabbed, habitable house that they now own and can market. But currently, as far as like straight from the current owner to a qualified bidder, there's only one receiver in Baltimore City, and that's OHAB.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. So I said we were going to wrap up, and we are, but I did get one last question that I think is worth getting to, and then we will close. But are there rehab programs for homeowners that have properties in need of rehab before? Well, I guess they're not principally occupying the unit, but are there programs to help owners who don't have the resources themselves to bring the property up to code, but they want to?
If you're asking, are you asking about for homeowners in their existing homes who want to invest in property, or somebody who maybe owns a vacant house is looking for access to capital and expertise?
Both.
Both? Okay. So for again, we have a home ownership program in Baltimore, and there's a number of different tools there, getting folks access to mortgage loans to buy homes, getting folks access to money, even if it's literally grant money, to make repairs in their homes. It's we got a phenomenal amount of money from the energy company merger here in Baltimore that produced a one-time windfall of $50 million to provide weatherization, which we sort of have bundled. We have some wonderful people running those programs to essentially put a new roof on somebody's house, because that's really what it takes to weatherize the row house. And so we do have some home ownership programs, but when it comes to like rehabbing a vacant house, one of the things that, at the 10,000 foot level, the most important point I want to make is that this stuff at the scale we have the problem, isn't about, somebody buying a house and trying to figure out how to rehab it. In order to make this work at scale, and this is something Baltimore has done maybe differently than other places, we try and get our vacants at scale into the hands of professional developers. That's how the city got built in the first place, and that's how, we're going to get the most traction at scale with our inventory. And so an individual buyer at a receivership or from the city, that can happen, but they're going to have to show they have the ability to rehab the property. And if you happen to live next door and you're trying to take care of a vacant that's been a problem for you forever next door to you, Jason has worked it out with the receiver that they'll be a lot more lenient on qualifying you. But in general, we're looking to move the inventory to people who know that it isn't the acquisition price here. It's not a dollar house. It's a $150,000 business problem, to rehab that house. And if you don't know how to do it right, you're going to fall off the horse. And so, we do have something called Baltimore Community Lending. We have some lending institutions, as local CDFIs we set up to provide financing and capital. But, I would just say at 10,000 feet, we're really looking to move inventory at scale to folks who can make that property available to our buyers. Most of our millennials are not looking for fixer-uppers. They're looking for product, and that's one of the great things that we've been doing here in Baltimore, is that our both for and nonprofit developers have been producing extraordinary product out of the ashes. They've even set up situations where, in Oliver, for instance, the 1500 block of North Broadway, they'll develop one house as a model, and in Greenmount West as well on Landvale, and then you come in and say, oh my God, this is amazing, I'll take it with granite countertops and this kind of cabinets, and your price will fluctuate. And so it's almost like a suburban tract model being used to renovate distressed areas in the city of Baltimore by professionals for consumers.
No, that's really fascinating. Think about getting that experience in a really urban environment, and it does highlight when you have a large inventory and getting to scale, you need a mechanism that's going to do that most efficiently. So professional developers make sense. And we did send out in the last, so every week we send out an email to our task force members, and just so you know, we did include a clip from
the local news station. Yeah, we did an interview with them. I think it was Channel 11.
And it showed it, like, kind of went on a tour of one of the rehab buildings, and it was beautiful. So.
Did you lead that one, Jason?
Yeah, that was the one when you had left, and it was Patterson Park, 945 Patterson Park with Ed. From,
nice. It was a receivership?
Yes.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, it's a great example.
Well, Rebecca, we're happy to help in any way. If you're ever looking for an equitable development piece, I think the combination of TRF and Build, the community organizers in Baltimore, is just a great example. You know, they really spend a lot of money. There's a lot of capital at stake, and they do it in a way that all the groundwork is laid, you know, in church basements.
Yeah, no, that's a great example that we will follow up on. We appreciate hearing about it. With that, I will keep my promise and we will wrap up. I did want to mention we are having our conference in New York, April 28th and 29th, Solutions for Housing Communications. So do check that out. And next week, April 12th, Urban Institute is holding an event on anchor institutions. You may remember we have shared some research that NHC has done about anchor institutions, and Urban is going to have 2 different panels talking about that from 12:30 to 3:30, and you can register on their website. And it may be webcast as well.
It will be webcast.
So just check that out, a more local opportunity. But thanks so much, Michael and Jason. Your presentation was really interesting and helpful, and I hope everyone has an enjoyable Wednesday afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.